How does a modern superpower grind to a halt without a single missile strike on its cities? That question has begun circulating across Moscow's industrial corridors as Russia's logistics collapse moves from highways into the heart of its economy. If trucks stop moving, can factories survive even a few weeks without raw materials and spare parts? The warning signs appeared first on the roads. Freight companies quietly vanished, fuel costs surged beyond profitability, and repair yards filled with immobilized Western-made trucks, waiting for parts that never arrived. What initially looked like a transport sector crisis has now metastasized into a nationwide industrial emergency. Assembly lines are falling silent, not because of bomb damage, but because steel electronics and basic components no longer arrive on time or at all. Across Russia's industrial regions, managers have begun implementing 4-day workweeks. Officially, this is framed as optimization. In practice, it is a controlled collapse. By cutting hours instead of laying off workers, factories avoid unemployment spikes that could trigger unrest. Paychecks shrink quietly. Workers remain employed on paper while losing up to a fifth of their income in reality. Inflation has already eaten away at purchasing power. Reduced hours deliver the final blow. This chain reaction is brutally simple. Without trucks, raw materials do not reach factories. Without factories, finished goods do not reach markets. And without markets, the state loses tax revenue needed to fund both social spending and the war effort. Western analysts describe this as a logistics-driven deindustrialization, an outcome long predicted under sustained sanctions pressure and wartime labor shortages. The labor problem is just as severe. With hundreds of thousands of men killed or wounded and many more having fled the country, factories face an acute manpower crisis. Skilled technicians are replaced by retirees, teenagers, or workers reassigned from unrelated sectors. Productivity plunges. Accident rates rise. Equipment breaks faster than it can be repaired. The industrial base still exists physically, but it operates like a body starved of oxygen. This breakdown carries strategic consequences far beyond Russia's borders. NATO planners have long assessed that sustained economic pressure, not battlefield attrition alone, would constrain Moscow's ability to wage prolonged war. As Ukraine intensifies strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, the logistics shock multiplies. Energy disruptions raise fuel prices further, deepening the transport crisis and tightening the vice around industrial output. In Washington, President Donald Trump's administration faces a delicate calculation. Western pressure is clearly degrading Russia's war-sustaining capacity, yet a rapid industrial collapse raises risks of escalation, internal instability, and unpredictable responses. European allies, meanwhile, monitor supply chain failures as indicators of how long Russia can sustain both military production and domestic stability. What is unfolding is not a sudden crash, but a slow-motion seizure. Factories do not explode, they simply stop. Workers still clock in. Machines remain idle. The state insists everything is under control even as production schedules quietly disintegrate. History offers a familiar warning: empires rarely collapse at the front line. First, they collapse when logistics fail at home. And if this industrial slowdown is only the first stage, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when shortages move from factory floors to family tables across the country? How does a country with vast farmland and centuries of agricultural tradition begin importing basic food products from abroad during wartime? That uncomfortable question is now being asked inside Russia as supply chain failures spread from factories into kitchens. If industrial slowdowns were alarming, the disruption of food distribution is something far more dangerous because it strikes directly at daily survival. The crisis is not rooted in empty fields. Russia still produces milk, grain, and meat in large quantities. The failure lies in moving those goods from farms to processing plants and from warehouses to stores. Transport costs have surged as fuel prices rise and trucking capacity collapses. Refrigerated vehicles sit idle, spare parts, unavailable drivers missing. Milk spoils before it reaches dairies. Crops wait in storage while shelves in cities thin out. Dairy products have become the most visible symbol of this breakdown. Butter shortages have forced supermarkets to install security boxes, an extraordinary step that signals not abundance but fear of theft. Prices rise weekly. Officials offer explanations that border on the absurd, blaming consumer habits rather than logistics failure. Yet the reality is, structural packaging materials once imported from Europe are unavailable. Processing equipment is breaking down, and maintenance crews lack both parts and skilled labor. The most humiliating moment came quietly without official acknowledgement. Russian retailers began selling cheese imported from China. For a country that once prided itself on agricultural self-sufficiency, this marks a strategic reversal. Dependence has not vanished, it has simply shifted east. What was once framed as economic sovereignty has become reliance on a single external supplier willing to exploit desperation. This shift carries serious geopolitical consequences. Western analysts note that sanctions did not aim to starve Russia, but to degrade its ability to convert economic strength into military power. Food insecurity accelerates that degradation by undermining morale at home. NATO officials have long assessed that domestic pressure, not battlefield losses alone, would determine the sustainability of Russia's war posture. At the same time, Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure amplify the food crisis indirectly. Power disruptions affect refrigeration processing plants and transport hubs. Fuel shortages ripple through agriculture just as they do through industry. Each successful strike compounds costs, delays deliveries, and worsens shortages hundreds of kilometers away from the target. In Washington, President Trump's administration watches these indicators closely. A population struggling to afford basic food places immense pressure on the Kremlin's narrative of resilience. European governments, too, recognize the pattern from late Cold War history. When food logistics fail, political stability follows quickly. The danger for Moscow is psychological as much as economic. Empty shelves and locked butter cabinets send a message no propaganda can erase. Military victories shown on television mean little when staples disappear from everyday life. Once food insecurity becomes normalized, trust in state competence erodes rapidly. If factories falling silent signaled the start of industrial decline, the strain on food supplies signals something deeper, a fracture in the social contract itself. And as households begin to prioritize survival over consumption, the next sector to feel the shock is the consumer economy that once kept urban Russia calm. What happens to a society when people stop buying, not because they choose to save, but because they have no choice left? That question now defines Russia's consumer economy as retail data reveals a sharp turn from discretionary spending to pure survival. If food shortages shook confidence, the collapse of consumer demand confirms that the middle layer of the economy is giving way. Shopping centers once symbolized stability under Vladimir Putin. They were brightly lit, filled with Western brands, and offered the illusion of normality even after the war began. That illusion is now fading. Foot traffic has dropped sharply across major cities, with regional malls suffering the most. Stores remain open, but customers browse without buying, calculating every ruble against rising food and utility costs. Retailers report that clothing and footwear sales have fallen noticeably year over year. This is not a fashion cycle. It is a behavioral shift. Households delay replacing worn items, repair what they can, and abandon non-essential purchases altogether. Western economists describe this as defensive consumption, a phase that typically appears just before broader economic contraction. Small and medium-sized sellers are being squeezed from every direction. Logistics costs have exploded due to fuel prices and transport shortages. Taxes are rising to fund wartime expenditures. Advertising costs climb as platforms consolidate. Profit margins vanish. Many sellers now operate at a loss, hoping only to survive another quarter. Industry insiders warn that a mass withdrawal from online marketplaces is likely next year, potentially wiping out half of independent vendors. The strategic implications are significant. Consumer spending is a key stabilizer in wartime economies, cushioning households against shocks and preventing unrest. NATO economic analysts have long argued that once consumer confidence collapses, state control must increase to maintain order, often at high political cost. Russia is entering that phase. Ukraine's continued attacks on Russian energy infrastructure add pressure to this fragile system. Power disruptions and fuel shortages increase retail operating costs, forcing further closures. Each strike has downstream effects far beyond its immediate military value, amplifying economic strain in cities far from the front. From Washington's perspective, President Trump's administration faces a dual reality. Economic pressure appears effective, yet accelerating consumer collapse risks unpredictable domestic responses inside Russia. European allies note that consumer withdrawal historically precedes labor unrest and political radicalization, especially in centralized systems. For ordinary Russians, the change is deeply personal. Shopping trips become calculations of necessity. Window displays lose relevance. The sense of future planning disappears, replaced by short-term survival. This erosion of everyday normality undermines morale faster than any battlefield loss. As retail spaces empty and small businesses close, the question shifts again. If consumers retreat and sellers disappear, what happens to services that rely entirely on discretionary income? The answer is already emerging in cafes, bars, and restaurants across the country, and it signals the rapid disappearance of Russia's urban middle class. What does a society lose when even its most cherished traditions become unaffordable? That question hangs over Russia as the urban middle class. Long the backbone of domestic stability begins to vanish under the combined weight of inflation, wage cuts, and shrinking services. If empty malls reflected caution, the closure of restaurants reflects surrender. For years, dining out functioned as an emotional escape. Even after mobilization and sanctions, cafes and restaurants remained full, offering a sense that life continued as normal. That illusion is now breaking. Ingredient prices have surged across the board. Dairy, vegetables, cooking oil, and meat now cost restaurants far more than customers are willing or able to pay. Passing those costs on means losing clientele. Absorbing them means operating at a loss. The result is contraction. Restaurants and bars are closing at a pace not seen since the early days of the pandemic. Those that remain open reduce hours, cut staff, or simplify menus to the bare minimum. For workers already on shortened factory schedules, hospitality jobs once provided supplemental income. Now those safety nets are gone. This erosion becomes most visible as winter approaches. New Year's celebrations, a cultural cornerstone, are being radically scaled back. Families are budgeting with extreme restraint. Traditional foods become luxury items. Gifts are postponed or eliminated entirely. What was once a symbol of abundance now reflects anxiety and exhaustion. Western analysts view this moment as a tipping point. The middle class plays a crucial role in absorbing economic shocks without political rupture. When it disappears, polarization accelerates. NATO strategists note that regimes under prolonged pressure often rely increasingly on coercion rather than consent once middle-class buffers collapse. Ukraine's sustained strikes on energy infrastructure deepen this effect. Rising utility costs hit households directly during winter, compounding food inflation and wage losses. Each disruption forces families to choose between heating food and savings. The psychological impact of that choice cannot be overstated. In Washington, President Trump's administration evaluates these developments through a strategic lens. Economic attrition is weakening Russia's ability to sustain prolonged conflict, yet social destabilization introduces risk. European governments recall how rapidly austerity eroded trust in state institutions during past crises. For Russian families, however, the calculus is immediate. When restaurant visits stop, celebrations shrink, and wages fall, the sense of upward mobility collapses. The promise that loyalty and patience would deliver stability is broken. A population in survival mode does not plan for the future. It endures the present. This shift sets the stage for an even deeper crisis. As spending contracts and morale erodes, the labor market itself begins to distort in dangerous ways. And when a country can no longer rely on skilled workers to maintain its economy and infrastructure, the consequences reach far beyond empty tables. Who keeps a nation running when its workforce is gone? That question now haunts Russia's industrial planners as the country confronts a demographic shock unlike anything in its modern history. Factories may still stand, but the people needed to operate them are increasingly absent or unqualified to replace those who are gone. Official statistics celebrate record low unemployment, presenting it as proof of economic strength. Western economists see the opposite. Employment is high, because labor supply has collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of men have been killed or wounded in Ukraine. Many more, especially younger skilled professionals, left the country to avoid mobilization. What remains is a workforce stretched thin, aging fast, and mismatched to the tasks required. Factories are now hiring pensioners, students, and workers without technical training. Skilled machinists are replaced by people learning on the job under pressure. Productivity falls sharply. Equipment fails more often. Industrial accidents rise. This is not modernization, it is improvisation. Analysts describe the system as a zombie economy, alive in appearance, but incapable of sustained function. The consequences extend into critical infrastructure. Maintenance crews for pipelines, power grids, and transport networks are understaffed. Repairs are delayed or done poorly. As Ukraine continues targeting Russian energy facilities, the lack of skilled labor magnifies the damage. Each strike takes longer to repair, increasing downtime and economic loss far beyond the immediate impact. From a NATO perspective, this labor crisis is strategically decisive. Wars are not won solely by weapons, but by the ability to produce, maintain, and repair them. Western defense analysts note that even advanced systems degrade rapidly without trained personnel. Russia's industrial base, already under sanctions pressure, now lacks the human capital to sustain itself. In Washington, President Donald Trump's administration weighs these developments carefully. A weakened labor force reduces Russia's long-term military capacity, but it also increases the risk of internal instability. European allies recognize the pattern from historical collapses when skilled labor disappears. Recovery becomes exponentially harder even after conflicts end. For ordinary Russians, the effects are tangible. Service quality declines. Infrastructure failures become routine. Fires, outages, and accidents are increasingly blamed on technical issues, a euphemism for exhaustion and inexperience. Trust in competence erodes with every visible failure. The demographic damage inflicted by the war will last decades. Even if hostilities ended tomorrow, the missing generation cannot be replaced quickly. Economic contraction becomes structural rather than cyclical. This reality brings the story to its most dangerous threshold, because when labor, logistics, and consumption fail simultaneously, the systems that bind a vast country together begin to unravel. What holds a country together when it can no longer move goods, by road, people by air, or heat its own cities in winter? That question defines Russia's final stage of systemic strain, as transportation, failures, infrastructure decay, and growing foreign dependence converge into a single national vulnerability. What began as a trucking crisis has now become a challenge to state cohesion itself. Russia's aviation sector illustrates the danger clearly. Cut off from Western spare parts and software updates, airlines have survived by cannibalizing aircraft, grounding some planes to keep others flying. That strategy is reaching its limits. Maintenance cycles are stretched, minor faults ignored, and safety margins reduced. For a country spanning 11 time zones, air travel is not a luxury, but a necessity. As routes are cut and risks rise, regions grow isolated from the center economically and politically. On the ground, winter exposes another fault line. Aging heating infrastructure, much of it laid during the Soviet era, is failing under pressure. Pipes burst, neighborhoods lose heat, and emergency repairs lag due to labor shortages. As Ukraine continues to strike Russian energy facilities, each outage compounds domestic vulnerability. The irony is stark. A state that weaponized energy abroad struggles to keep its own citizens warm. These failures reshape geopolitics. With European markets closed, Russia is forced deeper into dependence on China. Oil, gas, and raw materials are sold at steep discounts. Chinese goods replace domestic production, often at higher prices and lower durability. The relationship is not a partnership of equals, but one of leverage. Western analysts describe Russia's trajectory as that of a resource appendage, strategically useful, economically constrained. For NATO and the United States, this moment carries long-term implications. Under President Donald Trump, Washington balances pressure with caution. A weakened Russia has less capacity for sustained aggression, yet internal collapse introduces risks of escalation, fragmentation, or desperate external actions. European allies track infrastructure and transport failures as key indicators of how close Russia is to systemic breakdown. History offers a warning. States rarely collapse from battlefield defeat alone. They fracture when logistics fail, infrastructure decays, and trust in governance disappears. When goods do not arrive, when heat fails, when mobility ends, the idea of a unified state begins to dissolve. Russia now faces that convergence. Logistics stalled first. Industry followed. Consumption collapsed. Labor vanished. Infrastructure cracked. And through it all, foreign dependence deepened. The remaining question is not whether pressure is working, but how long the system can endure before the strain becomes irreversible. If this trajectory continues, the next crisis may not announce itself with explosions or declarations. It may arrive quietly in the form of isolated regions failing services and a population that no longer believes the center can protect or provide. Russia's crisis did not arrive with a single dramatic collapse. It unfolded step by step. First, the trucks stopped moving, strangling logistics across a vast country. That paralysis spread into factories where shortened workweeks and silent assembly lines masked rising unemployment and shrinking wages. From there, the damage reached food supply chains, exposing how even basic staples depend on functioning transport and energy systems. The result was humiliation abroad and anxiety at home as imports replaced domestic production. As inflation surged and incomes fell, the consumer economy retreated into survival mode. Shopping centers emptied, small businesses collapsed, and restaurants, once symbols of normality, closed their doors. The middle class, long the buffer of social stability, began to disappear. Behind it all loomed a demographic shock, a labor force depleted by war casualties and emigration, leaving industry and infrastructure staffed by exhaustion and inexperience. Now transportation failures, aviation risks, heating breakdowns, and growing dependence on China converge into a single systemic threat. From a NATO and US perspective under President Donald Trump, economic pressure is clearly reshaping Russia's strategic capacity, but it also raises risks of instability and unpredictable responses. So the final question is this: is Russia approaching a reversible downturn, or the point where economic strain becomes irreversible political fracture? If you want clear, fact-driven analysis of how economics, not slogans, shape modern wars, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for what comes next.